So this is our very first book discussion, and it is actually the brainchild of Brian. So Brian, can you introduce the series, tell people what it's about, and what we're going to be offering?
Absolutely. So the vision for this book series, Climate Readings and Discussions, is actually pretty simple. We want to gather up the best of what is known about climate and the collective challenges we face. We want you to feel empowered to take part in that discussion and to have a chance to ask your questions and hear directly from some of the best minds working on the subject today. And actually, we'd like to challenge a few ideas along the way. To a lot of people, talking about climate change can feel overwhelming. And when they think of climate books, thoughts turn immediately to science. Like the book that we're talking about tonight, our series of readings wants to show that climate is about science, yes, but it's also one of the original interdisciplinary subjects. All We Can Save shows how we are part of the big conversation, the big party, where we talk about literature and poetry and economics and politics and psychology and family and just being human. In fact, just about everything interesting under the sun is part of that discussion. That's why the Climate Center has attracted one of the finest and most diverse sets of faculty contributors on our campus at Texas Tech. That's why our invited writers will speak on very different topics, yet with a common unity. That's why we need you to be part of the conversation too. Because when we talk about climate change and solutions, it's going to take every voice and every creative solution. That's a significant part of the message of All We Can Save. As Ayana Johnson said about women in the climate conversation in a recent Rolling Stone interview, how insane to leave at least half the brainpower of the planet out of the conversation, right? And it's the hopeful aspect of our series, that the problems that are with us every day actually free up our imaginations instead of bogging them down. Climate invites us to read the signs and to embrace the fact that the challenges of our moment are interrelated. For example, climate change, COVID, and inequality, which Katharine talked brilliantly about to honor students last week. It invites us to stand with the ferocious optimists who say we can get to a better place by understanding those connections and acting on what we know and care about. So that's our vision. Welcome to all of you again. We are really and truly glad you're here with us, and especially thrilled that Ayana Johnson is with us tonight.
So it is my pleasure to introduce Ayana. We are going to be asking her a few questions. She is going to be giving us a reading, and then it is your turn to ask her questions. And I love this because the book we're talking about tonight, All We Can Save, was also co-edited by Katharine Wilkinson, who spells her name the right way. The right way, of course, being with 2 A's. But tonight, it is my pleasure to introduce Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. She is a marine biologist. If you have not seen her TED Talk, it is wonderful. It is a love story for the parrotfish, which is one of the inhabitants of the coral reefs. And of course, coral reefs are sort of like the canary in the ocean when it comes to climate change. And all the students who take my class watch her TED Talk. And I always ask at the end of each module, what was the most impactful thing that anybody said in any of the videos that you watched? And for the module with her TED Talk, I think half the students picked something that she said as something that was the most impactful of all the videos they watched in that module. So her TED Talk is wonderful. She has so many good things to say in her podcast, which is called How to Save a Planet. Are we screwed and what can we do about it? Everybody wants the answer to that. She talks also very vividly about what it's like to be a Black woman, to be confronting racism as well as the environmental crisis at the same time. And she says, you know, I work on one existential crisis already, but these days I can't concentrate because of another. Then she somehow found the time to put together this amazing collection of essays and poems that we're going to talk about today. And I was intrigued to find out that among her many areas of expertise, she includes seafood and instigating dance parties. So when coronavirus goes away, I feel like we need to be doing something else that involves seafood and dance parties, because that sounds like a lot of fun, even more fun than a Zoom meeting. But for now, this is what we've got. So welcome and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for such a lovely introduction. I'm really excited. I've been really looking forward to this. So, and thanks for assigning my TED Talk. That's pretty fun.
It is very fun, yes. All right, so Brian, do you want to take us away with the first question? Can't hear you.
Sure. Let's start with the basics. Sorry about that. Lots of people I know want to know this, and I have to say, the honor students, we had one of our best book club discussions ever out of your book club. I don't know what the magic was there. I think it was the book, but lots of people want to know where did this book come from to start out with? How did it get started?
Well, I think sort of to talk about the magic part briefly, I think it's the collective voice, right? Like, it's not my opinion. It's not, my co-editor, Katharine's opinion. It's not just Katharine Hayhoe's opinion. It's like 60 different people giving you their absolute best. And that is just pure magic, right? Because so often we've had this problem in the climate movement and other movements where it's like this single leader, this like heroic figure who's supposed to like lead us toward the solutions we need. And that doesn't always go so well, right? Like the civil rights movement probably could have done with elevating more leaders as far as a long-term strategy. So trying to learn from the lessons of the past and really think about sort of like, often Catherine Wilkinson and I would sort of look at whose voices were being listened to, who was being put forward as like the thought leaders on climate. And we're like, it's like 5 white dudes over and over again. Like, this does not represent the full spectrum of, brilliance and ingenuity and creativity, or the spectrum of topics that are related to climate. Brian, as you sort of introduced, climate change is a really big, complicated issue. We need a lot of different experts bringing a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different solutions, right? This is not just like solar panels and electric cars. And so the idea for this book was sort of born out of this frustration. We were at the Aspen Institute at a workshop facilitating this thing, and we were seeing that same thing over and over again. Like, who had the control, who had the mic, who had the money, who was deciding what was important. And so we kind of just like left the session and went on what we've come to call a rage hike in the Aspen Groves. And we're just like, everything is broken with like, who's in charge, right? Like, how can we mix this up? And books are often like, they're one of the traditional paths to being considered a thought leader, right? In academia, you can become a tenured professor and the people look up to you, and in the broader intellectual sphere, it's like, do you have a big book that's well known or is a bestseller? And so we knew that most of the people that we look up to who do important climate work, we're not going to stop to write an entire book. They're doing important projects, right? We need them to keep doing that work. We don't want them all to stop. So we thought, if we do an anthology, we can sort of bring the book to them, and we can, instead of elevating a single voice, we can elevate like dozens of incredible women leading on climate all at once, and sort of showcase that this is a chorus or a mosaic that's needed, as opposed to, a few single experts. So that was the motivation behind the project. And it's been such an immense joy to put it together, because it means I get to read all of this incredible stuff, learn about everyone's work, and sort of help it shine, and help the process of putting it out into the world. So I'm sure there's lots of other versions of the origin story, but that is certainly the sort of like the gist of it. Just born out of like frustration. Like, we got to do better. There's so many other people who we should be listening to, who should become household names. If this is the biggest challenge we're facing, then we need to be listening to a lot more people.
And I would say too, as a reader, having an anthology that has so many different voices. How many voices in total?
It's about 60. Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's what I thought. So 60. So reading a book with 60 different people in it, you're reading a single book and you get 60 different perspectives. If everybody wrote their own, treatise. You'd have to read 60 different books to get all those opinions. And frankly, speaking as somebody who wrote an essay in your book and somebody who just finished writing the manuscript of her own full book, I would say that you get 80% of what I have to say in a single essay. Don't tell anybody that. I still want you to buy that book too. But you get about 80% of people's main point in the single essay or poem or whatever it is they do. And so you're not only doing it to elevate all the voices in the anthology, you're actually helping everybody else who wants to know learn more from more voices by having that anthology, as opposed to having an entire bookshelf full of 60 books, which would cost a ton of money to buy and would take a ton of time to read, and most people wouldn't even do it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, so as we were curating it, it was really hard because it could have been 100 people, right? There are so many people doing important work. I think that's, worth mentioning. This is not like, these aren't the climate experts. These are like a spectrum of the types of experts, and like, ones whose work we've been particularly inspired by. And so in the curation process, I mean, there was this massive spreadsheet, right? Like we needed scientists, we needed activists, we needed lawyers, we needed policy experts, and farmers and artists and architects. We needed everyone, right? Like these are all part of the solution. If we've got, we've even got a supermodel in there because the fashion industry is a huge issue. And so, someone who's leading activism on climate within fashion was another thing we thought like, we should be including. And so figuring out how many different perspectives we could get in the book was super hard. So it was supposed to be, our book contract that we signed was for like a 60,000 word book with maybe like 20 essays. And then we were like, I'm sorry, we're going to need 25 essays. There's just like a lot of ground we need to cover. And then it was like 32 and like 39. And then it ended at like 41 essays, and we added 17 poems. And then at the end, we snuck in all these quotes, like AOC and Elizabeth Warren are in there represented as like quotes on a full page. Like the CEO of Patagonia has a quote on a page. Dr. Kim Cobb, didn't have time for an essay. So we got in like a quote from her. She's got her own page. And so we really wanted to show in a lot of ways that we hope that this book will be welcoming to people, right? The majority of Americans are concerned about climate change, but we're not all involved yet. A lot of us haven't found exactly where we fit in and what we can contribute. And so offering each of these essays as like a door into contributing to climate solutions just felt like something that we could offer, right? Like there's so many different ways to participate, right? Not everyone needs to be a climate scientist. Not everyone needs to be an activist in the streets. And so showing that there are all these different ways to participate, we hope that one or two of the essays will click with you. You might enjoy them all, but one or two you might say like, I could do that. Or like, I know someone who would be so excited about this and might want to sort of join up with this group or volunteer with this group or learn more about this thing. And so that's the goal, is to like, we took out as much of the scientific jargon as we could and tried to make it not oversimplified, but just super clear. It's not written for experts. It's written for anyone who's interested. And then as a way of like, come on, like there's so much being done. There's so much you can do. There's all these success stories you probably haven't heard yet that are super inspiring. And so that was kind of the vibe we were going for with the curation: diversity of expertise, as well as racial diversity and geographic diversity, sort of all across the US. And age, we've got like, teenagers to grandmas, and all of that.
And I have to say, I was just over the moon to see my friend Camille Dungy and the poets represented there, because some of us, I say this as a literature and humanities guy, some of us need to be poets and also to live comfortably in this zone of uncertainty, because a lot of people are feeling that way. And students, as you said, have reacted. They've picked up on different sections of the book. It's like everybody really feels a piece of it. And that's a wonderful thing. Now, the question I have following on with that, as someone who's edited a book and knows how hard it is to get like 5 writers together, much less 60, You've been running this incredible marathon for at least a year now. Do you have any funny or memorable moments to share about the process of putting the book together?
So it was almost exactly 9 months. We started this project the day after Christmas, where we like started reaching out to people and asking if they wanted to contribute an essay, and it was published September 22nd. So it was basically like we birthed a book. That was like the gestation period we had. So we only had like December, we had a full manuscript due in April. We then like did revisions in June, and it was like off to the press in July. So it was like a pretty crazy turnaround, especially because a lot of the essayists have been doing incredible work, but they're not writers, right? They're not journalists. They're people who know their stuff, but they didn't have anything ready to go. So some of these essays went through like 5 rounds of revisions. And so of course, all the stories that are coming to mind right now are the like, oh my God, what did we get ourselves into? Those moments when you're just like, what were we thinking? Let's see, I think because you mentioned the poetry, that moment of spark where we realized that we could put poetry into a climate book was just like, oh, of course. And then immediately we couldn't imagine the book without it. So, for those who haven't yet seen it, the book is divided into 8 main sections, and each section has like 4 or 5 essays and 2 poems and a few quotes and an original illustration. And that wasn't always the plan, right? It was just going to be like 20 essays. And once I think there were more essays, it became even more clear that we needed a way to like break them up and add room to take a breath between them, add like a way to process everything. There's a lot of information in there, and sort of some of it's pretty intense and some of it's joyful, but there's just a lot going on. And so poetry is just the perfect way to be reminded that other people have like felt this way and dealt with big things before and had to process them. And it just lets you take a step back and see the big picture. So the aha moment where we realized that we could just put poetry between essays that needed some space between them. And then it was like my job to read poems for 2 weeks, which is the best job ever, and like pick my favorites and figure out where they go. But maybe actually, okay, so along the lines of poetry, maybe my favorite moment is I've been, during most of the pandemic, living upstate New York with my mom, who's a regenerative farmer, which is one of the climate solutions that we highlight in the book in the Nourish section. And so that's why my internet is a little slow. I'm like, this farm internet is not the best, so thanks for bearing with me. But I woke up one morning and I walked out into the kitchen to have breakfast with her, and she's just like, I wrote a poem. I wrote a poem, and maybe it's for your book. And it's about climate victory gardens, this like World War II concept of like grow your own food and like be self-reliant, but like we need to do something similar for the climate. And so I wrote a poem about it. I was like, what? And I loved it. And so I had to like take this to my co-editor and be like, I'm super biased, but my mom just wrote a poem. Can we put it in the book? And it made the cut. And so like that brings me so much joy to have my mother in this book talking about like what agriculture needs to transform into, right? Like how can we leave behind this like super toxic industrial agriculture that's like releasing all this carbon instead of absorbing it? How can we take care of biodiversity and our communities and feed each other healthy food? And she just like, this is the beautiful thing about poetry, right, Brian? It just like distills everything to its essence in this like such a poignant way. And so that was just a moment of pure joy when I got the approval. First, when my mother presented this to me, and then when it made the cut to get into the book. So So you can find that in there.
How can that not be your favorite moment? Like, that's just too perfect. Well, we already have so many people asking you questions. So rather than us asking any more questions, let's ask you to give us a reading from some of your favorite parts of the book. We would love to hear from you in your voice.
Let me grab, the book is in the other room. Just
okay.
1 second.
No worries. And while she's doing this, don't worry, you can keep adding questions. We already have a lot of questions here. People have been upvoting them. I noticed that our top question so far is, what can one person do about climate change? And not coincidentally, that's actually the topic of my TED Talk. So I'll drop a link to that in the chat too. But have you found your spot yet? Give you a second to do that. In the meantime, we are going to hear from this book. Okay, let me spotlight your video. Just a second here. Okay, whenever you are ready.
So every day every time I pick up this book, it's a different part of it that jumps out to me as the part we need for that day or that moment. And so the thing that I'm thinking about right now, since we've been talking about poetry, is this poem by Naima Penniman, which kind of plays off of the last question, like, what can I do? Because it's called Being Human. And it might help to know that Naima is also a farmer, a Black woman who's a farmer upstate New York, and her sister Leah Penniman they've co-founded something called Soul Fire Farm. And Leah has an essay in the book too. So there's like a little bit of a family vibe going in the book as well. So here's the poem, Being Human by Naima Penniman. I wonder if the sun debates dawn some mornings, not wanting to rise out of bed from under the down feather horizon. If the sky grows tired of being everywhere at once, adapting to the mood swings of the weather. If clouds drift off, trying to hold themselves together, make deals with gravity to loiter a little longer. I wonder if rain is scared of falling, if it has trouble letting go, if snowflakes get sick of being perfect all the time, each one trying to be one of a kind. I wonder if stars wish upon themselves before they die, if they need to teach their young how to shine. I wonder if shadows long to just for once feel the sun, if they get lost in the shuffle, not knowing where they're from. I wonder if sunrise and sunset respect each other, even though they've never met. If volcanoes get stressed, if storms have regrets, if compost believes in life after death. I wonder if breath ever thinks of suicide, if the wind just wants to sit still sometimes and watch the world pass by. If smoke was born, knowing how to rise, if rainbows get shy backstage, not sure if their colors match right. I wonder if lightning sets an alarm clock to know when to crack, if rivers ever stop and think of turning back, if streams meet the wrong sea and their whole lives go off track. I wonder if the snow wants to be black, if the soil thinks she's too dark, if butterflies want to cover up their marks, if rocks are self-conscious of their weight, if mountains are insecure of their strength. I wonder if waves get discouraged, crawling up the sand, only to be pulled back again to where they began. If land feels stepped upon, if sand feels insignificant, if trees need to question their lovers to know where they stand. If branches waver at the crossroads, unsure of which way to grow, if the leaves understand, they're replaceable and still dance when the wind blows. I wonder where the moon goes when she is in hiding. I want to find her there and watch the ocean spin from a distance, listen to her, stir in her sleep, effort give way to existence. So this poem, I think, is so special because it like reminds us of why we're doing all this, and it doesn't take itself too seriously, right? And so this poem in particular, you know, we put in after a really hard essay that's called Loving a Vanishing World, that just talks about the pain of watching, you know, species and ecosystems decline. And to have after that this reminder of like the joy that there is in nature, and why all of this is worth the effort was just yeah, such a treat to be able to include this. And there is an incredible video of Naima reading this poem that EarthX produced, if folks want to look that up.
Is that available on the website?
I think it's not up on our website yet, but that's in the mix of things that that we'll add there on our events page. So yes, we do have a website that's allwecansave.earth. And if you want to learn more about all the contributors in the book, there's everyone's photos and bios there, and links to you know, their websites and their social media. You can find out more about them, and you know, sort of all the press and some excerpts and our other upcoming events if you want to hear from other contributors of the book. So so check that out. And then maybe I'll share this one other piece. So this is from an essay by Mary Anais Hegler, that some of the pieces in the book have been published previously, but then edited and updated for this. So this is one of those. And I'm not going to tell you the title because it's also the punchline. So I'll just start. Oh gosh, it's hard not to read this whole damn thing. I joined the climate movement in earnest in 2014. Since then, I've come across a good many doomer dudes. They have books, they host panels, they are prolific tweeters, they are legion, and they're almost always white men, because only white men can afford to be lazy enough to quit on themselves. I've given them a new name, denialists. They've absorbed all the disaster porn and memorized all the worst case scenarios, and they can rattle them off with rapturous pleasure. They've not only accepted that our fate is sealed, they've found comfort in it. So certain are they that they know how this unwritten story ends. I can only assume they're very obnoxious in movie theaters with their constant attempts to spoil the ending. To an extent, I get it. There's no denying the severity of our crisis, at least not anymore. There's no putting it off on future generations. There's no more stopping global warming. It's here. The chickens have roosted. Perhaps the most terrifying part of all of it is the uncertainty, the not knowing. It's unmooring, unnerving. I can understand reaching for something, anything to be sure about. And if you've nursed at the teat of toxic masculinity, I can understand why you might think you need to be the one in the room with clear-eyed vision, the one who knows what's coming next. But no one does. Because the thing about warming, whether we're talking about the globe or a fever, is that it happens in degrees. That means that every slice of a degree matters. And right now, that means everything we do matters. We quite literally have no time for nihilism. On the other hand, to be fair, the climate community can be maddeningly hawkish about their narrative and their messaging. We must be hopeful. We can't be alarmist. We must adhere to strict scientific nuance at the expense of clarity and urgency and beauty. We must leave no scientific rabbit hole unexplored. Nuance, nuance, nuance. This sort of tone policing makes the climate conversation impossible to have with any real honesty. not in a world where what we used to know as potential impacts of global warming now have proper names. Theoretical and hypothetical climate models have come to life in the forms of hurricanes Maria and Dorian, Typhoon Yutu, Cyclone Idai, the Camp Fire, and bushfires that have sprung up so quickly we can barely name them, so we just call them Australia. We've entered an age where these tragedies fade and blend into a continuum that we struggle to recognize as normal. Meanwhile, the climate community's insistence on hope everlasting begins to sound anything but realistic. At best, it's emotionally stunted. At worst, it's downright sociopathic. Not to mention that in order to have this type of hope, you have to be able to identify and articulate the solutions that would justify it. And that favors a certain type of expertise and raises the price of admission to the climate conversation to an astonishing, astronomical, unforgivable rate. We can't afford all these gates and all these gatekeepers. Again, we just don't have time. Granted, this reflexiveness is a byproduct of decades of relentless bad faith attacks from both industry and government, but the result is the same. It's exhausting, it's ineffective, and it's alienating. Honestly, it's not terribly unlike the denialist narrative. Both are mansplaining paradises. Both smack of the privilege wrought from the deluded belief that this world has ever been perfect, and that therefore an imperfect vision of it is not worth saving or fighting for. Both represent two sides of an overprivileged pendulum swung too far. But the community that prides itself on its scientific nuance can learn to embrace emotional nuance. It is absolutely possible to prepare for disasters that are already terrifyingly upon us while also doing our damnedest to quit baking more in. We can acknowledge the storm of emotions that comes with watching our world burn. We can process these emotions and pick ourselves up to put the blaze out as best we can, because it's worth it, because we're worth it. We don't have to be Pollyannish or fatalistic. We can just be human. We can be messy, imperfect, contradictory, broken. We can learn the difference between hopelessness and helplessness. Because what if we've been doing the equation backward? What if hope isn't what leads to action? What if courage leads to action and hope is what comes next? I've never seen a perfect world. I never will. But I know that a world warmed by 2 degrees Celsius is far preferable to one warmed by 3 degrees or 6. And I'm willing to fight for it with everything I have, because it is everything I have. I don't need a guarantee of success before I risk everything to save the things, the people, the places that I love, before I try to save myself. Even if I can save only a sliver of what is precious to me, that will be my sliver, and I will cherish it. If I can salvage just one blade of grass, I will do it. I will make a world out of it. I will live in it and for it. We don't know how this movie is going to end, because we're in the writer's room right now. We're making the decisions right now. Walking out is not an option. We don't get to give up. This planet is the only home we'll ever have. There's no place like it. And home is always, always, always worth it.
And is that the title?
There's so many parts of this book that just make me tear up too.
So you said the title was the punchline. So what is the title?
The title is Home is Always Worth It by Mary Anais Heglar.
That's amazing.
And so the two pieces that I've just shared with you sort of course, don't reflect the full spectrum of the book, right? I mean, there's pieces about specific solutions, and there's pieces about how we need to think about the broader work. And Katharine, your piece, How to Talk About Climate Change, is such a valuable contribution to this collection, because that's a big part of it. It's like, how do we talk about this issue to other people to build the bigger team, right? To welcome more people in, to make them understand that this is something they probably already care about. They might just be thinking about it in a different way. And so your essay appears in the section that's called Reframe, which is a whole section on like, how are we talking about this? How are we dealing with this? as a culture. And so I know people are like pretty familiar with your work, but I love your writing. And so I'd love to share just one little piece from yours.
Sure.
Which is hard because like it's got such an arc to the story. So like, so today when I encounter someone who's doubtful about the reality or the relevance of climate change, I don't start by talking science. Instead, I try to identify something we have in common. If they're a skier, it's important to know that the snowpack is shrinking as our winters warm. Maybe they'd like to hear more about the work of an organization like Protect Our Winters, which advocates for climate action. If they're a birder, they might have noticed how climate change is altering the migration patterns of birds. So the National Audubon Society has mapped future distributions for many native species, showing just how radically they'll be from today. If they're a parent like me, we both know how worrying it is that our children are living in a world that is far less stable than the one we grew up in. And I'll skip to the end, where you had successfully, reached a new audience that hadn't thought that they were on board. And you end this essay by saying, I had persuaded him by beginning with his values, showing my respect for them, and then connecting the dots between what he already cared about and a changing climate. And it worked, because to care about climate change, all we really have to be is a human living on planet Earth. Which is so great. Like everyone can be a part of this, right? Everyone is reachable. And the message and the messenger both matter, and your ability to do that and like spend so much of your sort of like intellectual power and your hours breaking through and helping other people figure out how to break through is such an amazing contribution to the climate work. So thank you, Katharine, for all the work that you do.
Well, thank you for the work you did putting this together and highlighting all of these amazing voices.
I mean, your science is pretty great too, let's be clear.
Thank you. I do science also. So we have, speaking of voices, we have lots of fantastic questions. And if you don't mind, I would love to dive right in, because so many people want to know so many things. We've been putting resources in the chat there. If you have any questions, you can still go ahead, ask a question, or upvote one that you want us to ask. But I'm going to start with the very first one, which is, what type of prompt did you give the contributors?
It, as is my style, I guess, like we made it incredibly hard for ourselves, and we didn't give anyone a prompt. We kind of just said, like, we really respect your work and we want people to know about it, and like, what are the stories you want to tell? So we basically had a phone call with everyone and said, what do you want to talk about? Like, what do you think is the most important thing for people to know? And so we really started from scratch. And for some people, like, for example, Marianne Hitt, who has been leading the Beyond Coal campaign at the Sierra Club for, a decade. And that work has led to 317 coal-fired power plants being shut down across the US, which is this incredible victory, right? Coal going from 50% to 25% or something of our electricity in just a decade. She had never written her story before. She had written press releases, she had given speeches, but she'd never told her story of how that work actually happened and the lessons that she had learned. So we worked really closely with her to get that out on paper for the first time, because that was what she needed to talk about. And like, that's really hard because you're talking about an entire decade of work in 5 to 10 pages. So that was one. And another example that's super similar is Jackie Patterson, who, sort of started up the NAACP's work on climate and environmental justice. Mm-hmm. And she's been leading that for over a decade. And she's, again, like, given speeches and done press releases, but never written her story of like how she came to understand climate as an intersectional justice issue, and mm-hmm. not just, an issue of like the environment, but like what that meant for the people that she cared about. And so sort of that became like a very much autobiographical piece from like her first experiences in the Peace Corps in Jamaica, you know, with oil refineries polluting neighborhoods, up to now leading this national effort. So yeah, I mean, every single piece is a different arc. Yours, Katharine, was a slight adaptation of one you had done before that you updated, which is like the thing you most wanted to make sure people got out of this collection, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
So about, I think 25 or 30% of the pieces were published before and then updated for this book. But a lot of them were brand new. And so those took like many, many rounds of like iterating and revising. And I think one of the other joyful things that I'm remembering as I'm sort of reminiscing about the editing process is how many of the essayists referenced each other's work.
Mm-hmm.
Without knowing who the other contributors were, which to me is like this beautiful moment of like all of these women who are respecting each other's, what everyone else is bringing to the table. And it's just like shine theory in practice, right? It's just a book full of like the most generous shout outs, which is the way we need to be approaching this. Like you're bringing something different than what I'm bringing, and like, of course we need to team up, and like, I don't know something, I can point to you, and vice versa. And so that just naturally happened in the book, because that is the way that this group of women, and I would argue like women more broadly, are approaching climate work as more of a collective, you know, like we're all in this together, sort of the work of nurturing and mending and like, and sort of like bringing together all the elements that are needed, this like weaving and quilting kind of approach to the work. So it was such a joy to see that happen.
I love that you said that, actually, because for people who follow me on Twitter, you know that I love making lists. And I just, over this weekend, you know, there's just this deluge of terrible information that you just feel like you're being inundated in under constant negativity. So I decided I'm going to make a list of scientists who do arts and crafts. And so I just sent out a call to say, hey, who does quilting or knitting or crocheting or whatever? And I got like 200 responses with photos of the most amazing art you have ever seen in your entire life. Everything from like woodworking and building their own boat to incredible knitted sea creatures. And it was just such an encouraging thing. And so I love that you actually use those words, because knitting and quilting and weaving are things that we can do metaphorically, but we also even tend to do them physically because they're creative, and creativity can take so many different avenues. And I think this book is an example of how diverse creativity can be. Well, speaking of diversity, we have a lot of good questions too. So Brian, what is the next question that you would like to ask?
Well, maybe this chimes a little bit with something that you talked about. I mean, I love the way that this book invites us to imagine a different perspective on things and the ways that we can support each other. But someone asked and pointed out, they said, this book is beautiful, which it is, but they ask, why might climate change be something people get so defensive about? I've heard many people, although they care about nature in general, get upset and deny the existence of human-induced climate change. So I'm curious, I mean, your book in so many wonderful ways points us to what we have in common, and yet there's the defensiveness. What are your thoughts about where that comes from?
So I will caveat this by saying, I think this is something Katharine knows more about than I do. But my sort of personal experience with people who are defensive about climate change is it comes from a few places. One is like, it's so big and scary that it's easier just to pretend it's not there, even if like you kind of know, part of you knows that it's real. You're just like, I can't even deal with this. And in those situations, often that manifests itself in a few different ways, right? Like humans couldn't possibly mess up the entire climate, or like, you know, people say like, well, even if it is true, like I'll be dead and gone by the time that happens. And it's such a such an enormous disruption to our way of life. I really didn't appreciate the title of Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, until like 2 years ago, when I was like, oh, it's really inconvenient. Like, to have to deal with like, okay, how do we not only like decarbonize our entire electricity system, but also change all of our transportation and, you know, like upgrade all of our buildings to make them more efficient and deal with like different heating and cooling, and, you know, change our agriculture and land use and our manufacturing. Like, that's everything, right? Like, we need to transform so much. And of course, it's sort of like easier to be like, it'll be fine. And I think there's sort of like, when we think of like climate denial or like climate science denial, it's often, you know, just this one thing, people who say like climate change doesn't exist, but there's a lot of like other variants of that, right? There's people who say like, we don't have to worry about it quite yet, who it's sort of like denial by way of delay. There's people who say like, you know, but, you know, or the science is unsure, which is a whole thing that's been sort of seeded by massive marketing PR campaigns by the fossil fuel industry to make us feel like the science is uncertain, even when it's absolutely certain. But I guess I would say like, you know, a lot of it comes from like people not knowing what to do about it, right? Like, if you think a problem is not solvable, then of course you're just like, I'm not even going to deal with that, right? And so I think part of what this book is trying to do is say like, there are so many solutions we already have at our fingertips. Like, pick one and find a way to contribute. Like, it's going to take all of us, and we don't know one of us can do it all, but we each can do something. And there's actually like the perfect line in the first essay of the book is by Shia Bastida, who is an 18-year-old youth climate activist, and she turned 18 while she was writing this. She's a freshman in college. And her essay is called Calling In. It's about like welcoming more people to this work. And the very end of her essay, and just for an inside scoop, so in her essay, there's a list of 10 tips for becoming a climate justice activist. And that's something that she had written on Twitter. It was like a Twitter thread. And as she was writing this essay, I happened to see that and then said, Shia, can we pull that in to here? It's like such great advice. And it's so distilled because it was written for Twitter. So that's how that found its way into the book. So this sort of, the curation of this was just like, wherever we found the best things, we tried to pull them in. But she ends the piece by saying, it's time to change our mindset towards implementing solutions. A vibrant, fair, and regenerative future is possible, not when thousands of people do climate justice activism perfectly, but when millions of people do the best they can. And I think if we like all sort of took on that perspective more, we would sort of stop beating ourselves up about like not having a zero carbon footprint, which again is a concept invented by like Exxon's PR team to make us all worry about our individual impacts instead of focusing on transforming our energy system. And instead we'd just like do our best. And so this is a very roundabout answer to your question, but I think it's sort of there's a lot of different reasons that people get defensive. And those are some of the ones I've experienced. But Katharine, I'd love to hear your take on that.
Well, no, I think you're absolutely right. In my experience, 99% of the time, and I'm a cautious scientist, so maybe it's actually 99.9% of the time, it's solution aversion. We don't think that we can fix it. And so because of that, our human instinct, our defense mechanism is to reject the reality of the problem. Because if we don't think we can fix something, then why would we worry about it? It just makes us a bad person if we can't fix it. And nobody wants to be a bad person. So talking about solutions is really powerful. And of course, it's all got wrapped up in that toxic mess that is political ideology today. And rejecting climate science, rejecting literally the number a thermometer gives you, has become a point of pride now for some people based on their political identity. But of course, the bad news is that it doesn't matter how you vote or what you think about something today. Climate change is going to get you anyways. And if we don't fix it, it's going to fix us. And that's why it is all about coming together rather than continuing to drive ourselves apart. And to that end, we have one more big question for you, and then we're going to do a speed round at the end. So the big
Okay.
question.
One thing on that,
Oh,
just
yeah.
let me add quickly, is for people who are interested in understanding sort of like how climate change became such a polarized political issue, which only just happened in the last dozen years. Like up until 2008, we had John McCain running on a pretty strong climate platform as a Republican. And you just obviously we're not seeing that anymore. You mentioned that I have a podcast, so How to Save a Planet. Our episode last week was called Making Republicans Environmentalists Again, which is obviously tongue in cheek. We know a lot of Republicans care deeply about the environment, but like, how did this denial of climate science become sort of like an ideological issue? So we sort of chart how that happened for people who are curious, like, where did that come from? Because there's a really interesting story there for folks who want to dig into that a little bit more.
That is perfect. I just dropped a link to that in the chat. And
Thank you.
We used to host a movie series back when people could get together in real life. And one of the movies we showed was Merchants of Doubt, which if you haven't seen it, it's a great documentary you can still watch today that charts the money that was poured into deliberately creating this polarization. Okay, so one last big question for you, and it is this one. It is the role of women in all this. As you have so famously said, why would we leave out half the population of the world when we need to fix this thing? And somebody noted that Ocean Collectiv, which is the organization you founded, it's all women. Of course, this book is all women. And one of the top questions is, this book, it really it pioneered a powerful concept of climate feminism. Do you ever fear that you would turn off some readers with such a strong feminist component? And how can we as readers introduce people to this concept with people who might be hesitant on both climate change and the important role of women in engaging in everything in this world, let alone climate solutions? If that isn't a big question, I don't know what is.
Yeah. So and it's a good one. And the answer is, it's not something we really thought about when we were putting together the book, because no book is for everyone, right? There are other books for other people. Like, we don't have to be the book for absolutely everyone. So that's, one piece of it. Although of course, the people who would be less likely to read this book are probably the ones who we would most want to read it. But that's the reason that, for example, like, you don't know from the cover, right? It's not in the title. Like, we thought about doing a subtitle that was like, wisdom from 60 women climate leaders. But that's not what we did, right? We said truth, courage, and solutions for the climate crisis. And so it's not something, it's actually something that the press has run with more than I had wanted them to. Like, I think of this as like, these are, 41 essays by people who are doing incredible work, and they happen to be all women, because like, we don't listen enough to women, so we're trying to rebalance that. But I tend not to even lead with the women part, because obviously, like, your brain power is like, you could compete with anyone on the planet, right, of any gender. So I think there's this to me, like, it's a hard question, because like, a lot of the assumption is that in doing a book of all women, it's saying something about like something negative about men's contributions, or saying something about like women being better. And that's not it. It's just saying like, these are voices we're not listening to enough. And so we're going to put some extra effort into making sure to get those voices out there. Of course, there are men doing important climate work. And so it's the same defensiveness that you experience. People are like, what are you saying? Like, men aren't doing good work? And it's like, of course they're doing great work. Like thank the Lord for Bill McKibben, right? Like, he's been doing this work for decades, and like, we need him, right? So this is nothing, this is nothing negative. It's just saying like, let me see. I think I can just like, instead of rambling, I can say it the way I said it before.
And while you're looking for that, let me just point out that Texas Tech actually archives Bill McKibben's writings. So the Sewell Collection,
cool,
which Brian is affiliated with, they actually archive Bill's writings here at Texas Tech, of all places. I mean, who knew? And so Bill is definitely somebody who is going to be coming on this series at a later date. So I'm so glad that you mentioned him.
I just put that link in
And
there, and
he
I do
is
have
doing
to put in a plug. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And Bill is someone who's sort of really committed to this idea of passing the mic, right? He has a newsletter in New Yorker magazine, and every week he's got like a pass the mic section. And 2 weeks ago, he passed it to me and Katharine Wilkinson to talk about the book, right? So this idea of just using your platform always to uplift other voices is something that I care a lot about now, that for whatever reason people listen to me. I'm like, well, if you're going to listen to me, I've got 60 other people I want you to listen to too, right? Because that's the way that we sort of like open the door for each other. So the way we summarized this in just a few sentences in the book was, all around the world, women and girls are making enormous contributions to climate action, conducting research, cultivating solutions, creating campaign strategy, curating art exhibitions, crafting policy, composing literary works, charging forth in collective action, and more. Look around and you will see on the rise climate leadership that is more characteristically feminine and more faithfully feminist, rooted in compassion, connection, creativity, and collaboration. There is a renaissance blooming in the climate movement. And that's what we wanted to capture. We wanted to capture this like really beautiful collective coming together. And we use the word renaissance instead of like revolution or revolt, right? Because it's a rebirth. It's not a tearing apart of something else. And Renaissance hearkening to like the artistic elements of this too. And so trying to take this out of the purely scientific and the engineering, like as if like 8 engineers in a conference room somewhere could solve climate change. Like that's clearly not what this takes. This takes something much bigger than that. So that's kind of what we were trying to get at. And Ocean Collectiv actually was all women by mistake. I was looking for people to collaborate with who I trusted and like could communicate well with, and who had expertise in ocean conservation, and who were like sort of free agents, right? Who could do consulting projects with me because it's a consulting firm. And I made a list, and there was one guy on the list, and he happened to be starting his own conservation technology group. And so I didn't invite him. And so it wasn't on purpose. It's funny, I've ended up doing all these like women focused initiatives, but the motivation hasn't been like women are the best. It's just been like either these are the people I want to collaborate with, and it just happened to be skewed that way, or it was like whose voices are not being listened to. And so on that same note, like 40+% of the contributors to the anthology are women of color, because we know, I mean, quantitatively that their work is, you know, underfunded, underappreciated. And so making sure to include that element of it too was super important to us.
Well, I think that's the perfect note to end on, actually. I don't think we could do any better. So if you want more, we've put links in the chat there. Check out her website, follow her on social media, watch her incredible TED Talk about parrotfish and coral reefs. If you haven't read the book yet, maybe you're inspired to buy it. We didn't even mention that there's an audio version where some of the essays and poems are read by Jane Fonda and America Ferrera and Julia Louis-Dreyfus and other people like that. Thank you so much for being our guest on this first inaugural book chat. Thank you everyone for your amazing questions. Thank you, Brian, for having this idea. And why don't you go ahead and close us out?
Well, I just have to say, and I'm being very sincere, I get it now. Some of the magic of our discussion, that magic is you, Ayana. You've given us an incredible gift here. And I think we all got a sense of it in this discussion. So we couldn't ask for a better person to get us started with this series. Thank you so much from all of us.